Welcome to Behind the Prop Podcast, where each week we will bring you stories, lessons, and some tips from behind the prop. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Pre-show checklist, microphones,
Check.
sound check,
Complete.
recording all channels,
Checked and verified. Pre-show checklist complete.
tower, Bravo Tango Papa is holding short, ready for departure.
Bravo, Tango Papa, you are clear for takeoff. Have a great show.
You're clear for takeoff and Wilco, Bravo Tango Papa.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm good. This is another systems episode. Last month we did the ignition system and magneto check, which has been listened to many times and will probably be listened to many times in the future as people ask me questions and I point them back to that episode. This week we're going to talk about flight controls, and it's going to be a good show. It's going to be a little bit about GA flight controls. You're going to share some insights on some really big aircraft and their flight controls. So let's jump right into it. We're going to talk about primary flight controls and secondary flight controls. Everything from a private pilot and what they need to know all the way up to a captain on a much larger aircraft and how those flight controls work, all in the sense of trying to make better pilots, making you safer, and making you fly more coordinated. Primary flight controls, those by the book are, and there's maybe more, but we're going to keep this at a high level today, ailerons, elevator, and rudder. We check those flight controls on a regular basis during run-ups. I think every checklist probably says flight controls free and correct. What does that mean to you, free and correct, Wally?
Well, free obviously means that they feel right, aren't any kinks in the cable, and correct is that they're going in the correct direction. You push the left rudder, that rudder in the back, which as you're sitting there, you can't see it, is deflecting to the left, and the aileron's going in the proper direction, that sort of thing. I would say one of my pet peeves on general aviation checklists is that the flight controls on the checklist is usually on the before takeoff checklist or the run-up checklist. And I've always told people, I said, let's just take a airplane that rents for $120 an hour. That's $2 a minute you're paying for this airplane. And the economics of waiting till you're out at the end of the runway to realize the ailerons have been put back on the airplane and they're backwards, why not check that before you even start the engine of the airplane and take care of it before you even taxi out to the end of the runway? So I've always wondered why that was on the before takeoff checklist rather than before you even start the engine. Before we're paying $2 a minute, let's go ahead and check them right now. Remember, checklists are checklists, and for the most part, we use them as do lists. We read it, and it tells us to do something. We do it. A checklist is a document that we use to make sure that a task has been done. So, can we get in the airplane right now and do the flight control check before we even before we turn the master on and start that engine? Absolutely. And we get to the end of the runway, and it says flight controls check. We can say, well, we've checked the flight controls.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I flew with someone recently who I was observing them as they were pilot in command doing the run up and going through this process. And as they checked the flight controls, they turned the yoke to the left and looked to the left, and they turned the yoke to the right and looked to the right, and they pushed on the rudders and they looked back, as you can see that on a small GA aircraft, and they said everything's good. And I said, well, which way is the left aileron supposed to go when you turn over there? And they were like, I don't really know the answer to that question. And I said, well, you saw it move. Did it move correct? Like the checklist does say free and correct. And they were like, I'm not sure what that, you could see that all of a sudden kind of clicked for them, like, I've really always been checking that they were free and moving, because that could be really bad if you left the control lock in.
Yeah.
But it's really about, I have heard horror stories of cross cabling and ailerons being put the wrong way. That would be very awkward to try and turn left and the airplane go right. That
Yeah.
would be very weird.
Yeah.
I think we would all struggle with that dynamic if we were wheels up and that happened.
Yeah.
So the tip that my instructor taught me was put your thumbs up on the yoke. If you turn the yoke towards the left, your thumbs are up. That aileron should be up. If you turn to the right, your thumbs are up. That aileron should be up. And what I think is important, and I try to teach people when I'm flying with them, is when you do that, don't just look right. While your thumbs are pointing up to the right, you might want to look back to the left and see that aileron is down.
Right.
That way you know that they're both working. I doubt it could happen, but it would be really bad if you did that and they both went up, or you went to the left and they both went up. That's probably going to be a very awkward feeling in an aircraft if you didn't have those moving in the correct direction.
I will. I'll confess on myself. I was teaching a CFI candidate a long time ago, and we were in a Cessna 150. And again, this gentleman was a commercial pilot at the time, and wanted to be a CFI. And so he went out and he pre-flighted the airplane. I went out and I hopped in the left seat because I was acting as the student. He was acting as the CFI. And we took off. And as we were climbing out, he said, the rudder feels funny. And I said, well, it's fine. Let's just keep going. And probably about 1,000 feet, he says, no, this just doesn't feel right. And so I took the airplane and I put my feet on the rudder pedals, and I went to move them, and sure enough, yeah, it didn't feel right. And I turned around and I could see out the back of the airplane, and there's this big red flag trailing behind us that said, "Remove before flight." So we had taken off with a rudder gust lock installed, and I pointed to him. I said, well, there's our problem right back there. We got a rudder gust lock installed. And his comment to me is, well, what are we going to do? And all I could think of is we can't go back to where we took off from, because that would be embarrassing. So I said, we need to go to fly to another airport and go land there. And he wasn't really too happy with that idea. It was only about 10 miles away, but I said, well, let me try something. So I took the airplane and I just started kind of tapping on the rudder pedals, and I could look back there and see that this gust lock was vibrating and it was moving up as we did that. And after about 20 seconds of kind of tapping on the rudder pedals, we got this rudder gust lock to fall out, and it was all fine. And I just imagine this falling in somebody's front yard and them looking at this remove before flight thing and thinking, well, I guess they didn't do that. So anyway, it all turned out just fine. But there was an example of, obviously, we didn't check the flight controls. We didn't check the rudder. And so at this particular flight school, we had these rudder gust locks that we never used, but that day somebody used it and we missed it.
Yeah. And that, while that's not good, that's not the most unsafe thing you could do. I have heard horror stories of people getting all the way onto the runway using, steering with their feet and not checking those flight controls, and the actual control lock still being in the yoke, and not being able to take off or not being able to control the plane once they were airborne, because they left that control lock in. You would think, how could that possibly happen? But I guess it could happen, and you'd
Wow.
would really want to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I've learned so much more about these as I've started working on my CFI ratings, and I think at that level you start, maybe as a private, you learn what they do and you learn how they work at a 50,000 foot view. No pun intended on height there, but as a CFI candidate, you're really learning, like, it's not just deflecting wind, it's creating more drag, and then that drag creates other things to the aircraft that causes problems. And how do the ailerons work with the rudder to keep the plane coordinated through a turn and those sorts of things. You wish you could inject all that to a private pilot, I guess, but it's just too much, right? So
Yeah.
the years and years of teaching, we do kind of educate at the right stages and levels on those things, but it is interesting just how much happens when you turn that yoke and those ailerons deflect wind in a 20-degree bank to the left. There's a lot going on between drag and thrust and horizontal lift and vertical lift and lots of things that we don't teach private pilots, but it's pretty important to the bigger picture as you get up in through commercial and CFI ratings.
Yeah. I think what we have to understand is what do flight controls do? In a very simple term, they deflect air, and maybe in a better term, they deflect airflow. So what we have to realize is that at faster speeds, the flight controls are more effective than at lower speeds. I go back to a Boeing 727. I flew that for many years. 727 had this system on it called the rudder load limiter. And the hydraulic system on that airplane, as in most modern big transport category jets, is usually around 3,000 pounds of hydraulic pressure. Well, the rudder load limiter, what it did is, I guess when Boeing designed the airplane, they realized that the rudder did not need 3,000 pounds of hydraulic pressure to be effective. So what they have done is in cruise flight, in other words, with the flaps up, when the flaps are in the up position, the rudder load limiter limits the rudder pressure to 800 pounds of hydraulic pressure. When the flaps are out of the up position, that pressure increases to 2,400 pounds. And there's all the logic in the flap handle and all that kind of stuff. And I don't want to get into all that. But the bottom line on that airplane, with the flaps not up, you have more pressure to the lower rudder than you do with the flaps in the up position, i.e. you're going fast, you got a lot of airflow, you don't need that rudder to move as much. And what I see with younger pilots, I see this a lot on crosswind landings. They're used to using the rudders a little bit, and most of the time, we're climbing out and we're saying, okay, make sure you center the ball and you step on the ball, you put whatever rudder input is necessary to center that ball. And I'm going to just talk in terms of percentages, but probably we're not using that rudder more than about 20%. But on a crosswind landing, we come in and we're crabbing into the wind, and we're saying, okay, line the airplane up with the runway. And they're used to using 20% rudder. And at low airspeeds, you're coming in 55, 60 knots in a crosswind, you might need 50, 60% rudder, and I just find that younger pilots are reluctant to put that much rudder input in. So a lot of times I'll ask the candidate, how much rudder do you need to line up the runway on a crosswind landing? And I usually get the glazed over look. And the answer is whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to get the airplane lined up. I mean, we definitely don't want to land these airplanes in a crab. It just puts kind of stress on the landing gear. So and it makes it feel like a really rough landing.
Yeah, I've been known to watch a few YouTubes on crazy landings of big jets, Wally, and a lot of times in big jets and in crosswinds, it almost appears that they do land in a little bit more of a crab. Is that still just a bad landing in a big jet, or are they designed to take a little bit more of a crab landing?
Some airplanes, for instance, I fly the 757, and that is one of the techniques to land it in a crab. You can do that. We have basically 3 different crosswind landing techniques in that airplane, and all 3 are acceptable, and it's really the choice of the pilot, how he does that. I personally don't do that. I like to use the aileron basically lined with the runway, and one main wheel first, then the other main wheel, then the nose wheel.
So you fly the big ones just like you fly the little ones.
I do, and the more I fly, I realize it's all the same. I have found myself in the big airplanes we don't get the number of landings that we get in small airplanes. I mean, if I get 4 landings a month in a big jet, that's a pretty good month for me. But I do find, if I'm in a landing slump, I have a couple of landings in a row that aren't really what I consider good landings. Probably my problem is I'm not looking far down the runway. My aim point is too close in, and if I just shift my eyes up, and this is lots of landings, and I still have to remind myself, look far down the runway.
That's amazing. Maybe we'll do a show on just landings. We probably have a lot to talk about there as well. So we've spent quite a bit of time on rudder and ailerons, really what free and correct means and how that works. I think if you put those two together and you think about what Wally's saying at higher speeds and lower speeds, you will learn how to control the aircraft a lot better. I can't remember even thinking about these things when I was a private pilot. I just knew the rudder helped my longitudinal axis stay on the center line, and it helped me keep the ball centered. I don't think I put a lot of those things together to help me be a better pilot, but you can do that. And then the elevator. I teach Boy Scouts sometimes on the weekends here, Wally. The Boy Scouts group will come, and the question that'll always get them is, what happens to this elevator? Which way does it deflect when I pull back on the yoke, right? I think we could all say that as we learn about aircraft and planes, the deflection's probably opposite of what we think is going to happen.
Right.
And it often catches a lot of 10-year-old boys that are in Boy Scouts, and they pick the wrong direction. But as I push forward on the yoke, the elevator actually goes down to take the nose of the plane down, right? So it's deflecting the wind, causing the entire aircraft to do something, right?
Right.
And so as we use that elevator, and we're going to check that elevator, we need to make sure it's moving in the correct direction as well. I like to do that during pre-flight, remove the control lock. I go back there. I don't grab the thin metal stuff. Please, students, don't grab the thin metal stuff, but grab there's a counterweight in that rudder, and there's a big chunk of plastic on the side of that rudder, and I'll move that and make sure that the yoke is moving in the correct direction as I move that elevator. You want to make sure that thing's going in the right direction as well. It's going to be a very valuable tool as you leave and come back to the airport.
Yeah,
for sure. But probably one that we don't talk a whole lot about because it is one that moves not as often, and once we get in flight, it's probably not a big piece of what we're doing unless we're trying to change something during a specific maneuver. But that does kind of bring us to secondary flight controls, because on that elevator we have a trim tab, and we use trim and trim tabs to help us fly and fly better, and flaps. So there's other secondary controls, spoilers, air brakes, other things, but we'll stick at a high level here and think mostly GA aircraft. Talk to me a little bit about what you see maybe on check rides as it relates to flaps. I'll tell a few stories on what I see on the flight line at a flight school with flaps, but what are your thoughts around flaps as a big picture, both pre-flighting, making sure they're working and that they're maybe clear from debris, bird's nest, those sorts of things? What do you think about when you're observing a check ride student, private student, doing that walk around the first time? What do you really want to see them do with the flaps and the flap controls on a check ride, Wally, if you can share that?
Yeah, well, as far as that goes, I have never really seen any problem areas. Everybody is very very diligent. Of course, they're under the watchful eye of
they're
an
at their
examiner.
best.
They're probably behaving. Whether they do that in the real world or not, I don't know. I do know that I have learned, especially a Cessna high wing airplane. I have learned to watch my head, because man, I've banged my head on many a flap. Luckily, I don't think I've damaged any, but I've probably killed a few brain cells. But you just want to just make sure everything, all the connections, just common sense. Make sure everything is working properly. Obviously, in a Cessna, you're going to have to turn the master switch on to move those flaps to get them to come down. And a Piper or an airplane has manual flaps. You get to move them manually. But I haven't. I don't think I've ever really seen an issue with anybody.
And I fly Cessnas more than I fly Piper aircraft or low-wing aircraft. And somebody, probably in my commercial time frame, I was going through my routine of pre-flighting and put the flaps down, and I watched them both go down, do a little bit of check. They're going down. And then I probably reached over and put them up and moved on to other things. And they were pretty diligent to see if I was pretty passionate about watching them go back up. Because if you think one's a little bit slower than the other, that could create a real adverse effect on you as you might be changing the flaps on the go. If you did 10 degrees of flaps and then you're raising those flaps, one comes up first, that could create a really awkward feeling. So something that I've kind of stuck to since is watching those come up. Another tip that was given by another instructor that flew with me at some point was I went down, it was an aircraft that could go to 40. And I had taken those flaps all the way to the bottom so I could get in there and check all of the connectors and make sure all the nuts were safety wired and all this stuff that I think is important. And he goes, why would you go to 40? And then I said, well, that's what I was taught. And he goes, can we take off with 40? And I said, no, we can't take off with 40. And he goes, well, what if we were in a remote airport? Do you do this every time? And I thought it was an ingenious tip that said, hey, if you're on a remote trip, maybe you're that 10 minutes away on an airport on a training flight, and you stop and eat a $100 hamburger, you might not want to check all the way to 40 because you can't leave if they got stuck in the down position. But if you go to 10 degrees, you can take off, you can fly safely. It's going to be a little slower, but you can definitely get back to your home airport. So I've incorporated that into my own pre-flight mechanisms that if I'm at a remote airport, at home I always check 40 or the full flaps, look really good at everything. But on my return flight, I never go past 10 so that I can get back in the air and come on home. Just something to think about as it's related to flaps.
That's an excellent point. I got my seaplane rating up in Fairbanks, Alaska, probably 6-7 years ago. And the airplane that I was flying in was a Cessna 172 on floats, obviously. And we used to go out to this area just west of Fairbanks, probably 30 miles, called Mento Flats, and do all our landings in this lake. And they do have a water runway at Fairbanks International Airport. And when we came back in, we determined that the flap motor had burned out, and we didn't have flaps. And obviously, we came in and landed, but we were discussing in a 172 on floats, you have to have flaps for takeoff, and we were just fortunate that it happened where it happened, because we'd been out there on the lake out at Mento Flats, 30 miles outside of Fairbanks. There's not much out there. It would have been a big hassle to get
no
someone
mechanic
to come
shops
out
on
there.
the lake.
Exactly.
Yeah, I thought that was a great tip they gave me, and I've used it ever since. And I challenge people to put that into their toolkit for no better sense. Obviously, if you're concerned, check it full. Do the right thing. But if you're on a short day trip, you might consider doing 10 degrees on your pre-flight to come back.
Yeah, and I incorporate that into an electrical system failure. I know we're kind of maybe getting off of the flight controls, but in a Cessna that has electric flaps, if you have an alternator failure and you're on the battery, at some point that battery may fail and we might have a total electrical failure. It might be a consideration to not doing a full flap landing, just for the standpoint is if you do put the flaps all the way down to 40 and you can't get into your airport and you have to go around, and then you did have the total electrical failure, you'd be stuck with the flaps at 40. So it might be a good idea to say, hey, let's just make this one a no flap landing, or a flaps 10 landing, or a flaps 20.
Yeah.
something that's a little bit more manageable if you had to.
Good tips. Good tips. The other secondary control that we're going to talk about is trim and the trim tab. Again, something that I don't think I was super proficient at pre-solo. That I think I remember, and I'm not sure why it made me so jealous. But at this airport, you leave and you fly under a Bravo shelf that's 2,000 feet, probably for about 7 miles, 6-7 miles, maybe 10 total. And you get out there, you climb your full power in these 172s, full power with an instructor, get to 1,700 feet, and they trim it out, and the plane just stays right at 1,700 feet. And I was so jealous of how well my instructor could do that. And it does come with time and experience, but man, I would be chasing that trim. And they kept trying to teach me, if you just get level first and then trim it, you'll get there. And boy, I just never could quite get it right. So I was chasing this altitude all the way out of this Bravo shelf, and was so jealous how quick they could trim it. And now, of course, fly with people who are like, how do you trim it so well? And it is an acquired ability that you just can't teach. You can talk about it all day, but you just can't teach it. But trim is a beautiful thing once you learn how to do it well.
Yeah, I watch applicants struggle with that all the time, and it's pitch power trim. So you level off, you use pitch to level off, and then after you're leveled off, then you pull your power back, then you trim. I see people, as they're leveling off, they're pulling the power back, and the airplane slows, and they're just struggling. I would say that if I have an applicant who is struggling with steep turns, probably 80% of the time it's because the airplane is not in trim. And I'm amazed when I'll take the airplane to do unusual attitudes on a private or an instrument check ride. I'll say, okay, I have the airplane, and they give the controls to me, and it's like, gee, boy, this airplane is totally out of trim. And I'm thinking, what have you been doing? You've been working way too hard. You shouldn't have to work that hard. You ought to be able to just let go of things. And it's an acquired skill. It's not something that you're going to master on day one. I remember the first time I started flying multi-engine airplanes, my instructor could just reach up there and just move his wrist around on those prop controls and sync up the props. And then I tried to do it. It took me 10 minutes to get the props in sync with each other.
Where they went, wow, wow, wow.
Yeah, exactly. So it's something that you will get better at. But just know that flying, you should be able to let go at any point, and the airplane not, keep going the way you want it to go.
Well, I'm lucky to get to fly a beautiful 182T on a regular basis at this flight school, and try to have people fly with me or ride with me on trips that I take in that thing, because it is a treat. But I do like to have people watch how the autopilot flies the aircraft, because if you think about us, and if we try to hold a heading, unless we've got hundreds of hours, we probably don't hold a heading. We can't hold a heading near as good as an autopilot, and we find ourselves moving the controls in big swaths, right? Which deflects more winds, which means we're trying to get back to where we were. But you can take and turn off the autopilot in the 182T that's here, and the plane will start to drift, and then I can just hit autopilot again. And if you watch what the yoke and trim do, it's not much.
Right.
It's really not much. The yoke might move 2-3 degrees, and the trim tab might move up less than 1/8 of an inch to get it back. And it might wobble a little bit, but it gets it. And I try to tell people that are private students or young pilots when they fly with me in the 182, honestly, this is how you should move the controls as well.
Right.
To get back, if you lose, as you've talked about, 1 dot of deflection on an ILS, you probably don't need 20 degrees to get that back.
Exactly.
And the autopilot knows that, and we're not astute to that.
Yeah.
But I do find it interesting to let people see, like, put the nose down even on the 182. Maybe we got a ball of deflection on the horizon, artificial horizon, and I'll put it back and say hold altitude, and you watch what that trim does, and it doesn't do much. It doesn't really fight to jump to get all that back. it slowly and steadily gets it and climbs right back out on its altitude. So it's a pretty cool way to let people see how autopilot flies the aircraft, because I think if we would all fly and use those flight controls in a similar manner, we would be a little bit more stable and not be chasing things as much.
Yeah. I would just say one little flight control kind of funny story. When I was getting my seaplane rating up in Fairbanks, basically in big jets, you fly with your feet on the floor. You don't use a whole lot of rudder input in big jets unless you have an engine out, obviously, that comes into play, and then you use a whole lot of rudder. But anyway, so I was just getting back into general aviation airplanes, and I had a 172. I thought I knew everything I needed to know about a 172. And so here we are flying this 172. It did have the 180 horsepower engine. It had power flow exhaust. So as far as 172s go, it was kind of a hopped up 172. But my instructor, Craig Kenmuth, great guy. As we would climb out, and the performance wasn't great on this airplane with these huge floats hanging down below. But as we climb out, especially on climb out, he loved to look over at me, and he always called me Captain, because he knew I was an airline pilot up there, and he would say, "Captain, your ball is not centered." And he loved that phrase, and I just would look at him, and I would look down at it, and I'd press the appropriate rudder to center my ball. But I just remember him saying that over and over and over again. I don't know what it is about that phrase, but he loved to tell me, "Captain, your ball is not centered." So but it was a really good reminder, and I kept just using the excuse of, well, in big jets and his comment was, well, Captain, you're not in a big jet today. So we had a good time, but it was a real good learning experience for me, and so now I'm much more aware of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure I haven't flown commercial a lot this year, but I would think I could feel, even in a jet, if it was uncoordinated. A big plane, I think I could feel if it was uncoordinated. I think in a smaller plane, if we fly regularly, I think our bodies feel it being uncoordinated.
Yeah.
And now, for sure, if I'm not in control of the controls, I can really feel it, and I can just look at that ball or that slip indicator, and I know, oh my gosh, we're way out of coordination. And what I don't think I knew early on, and what I try to coach people on today is, you're creating a lot more drag if you're uncoordinated and you're
Absolutely.
flying straight and level, and you're wasting fuel and you're wasting time. And if you can just get coordinated, trim everything out really well. If you got rudder trim, use it. If you don't, keep your foot on the pedals and keep that ball centered. It's going to make a big difference in a long cross country on just how much fuel you burn and how much time it takes to get somewhere.
And the small airplanes, a 172 is probably set up to where it's coordinated in cruise. So because that's where you spend most of your time, I guess, in theory. So it's probably going to require rudder input in the climb.
Yes, for sure. All right, well, that's our show for the day. Primary, secondary flight controls, a good little systems course for anybody who wants to learn more about those controls. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop. Thanks for listening.
Bravo Tango Papa, we are clear of the active runway and would like to taxi to park.
Bravo Tango Papa, taxi to park. Great show. Have a nice day.
Taxi to park, thanks. You too, Bravo Tango Papa.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Prop. Please follow us on social media @BehindTheProp or visit our website, www.behindtheprop.com. Until next week, fly safe, everyone.